Hello and welcome to our tutorial on using Band-in-a-Box for Mac with different software synths such as Garritan Jazz and Big Band, IK Multimedia's SampleTank, Native Instruments Kontakt Player, and many more. Right now we're listening to a Band-in-a-Box style that uses MIDI super tracks. We have real drums, real tracks acoustic guitar, and MIDI super tracks bass and MIDI super tracks piano. With the sounds of the real drums and guitar coming out of Band-in-a-Box, and the MIDI bass and piano routed to the ARIA player, where we have the acoustic bass and piano from Garritan Jazz and Big Band loaded. In this video, we're going to show you how you can get your own system set up like this, using various different standalone synths to play back MIDI that is sent from Band-in-a-Box. We'll start off simply by having Band-in-a-Box play everything through a single synth, and then we'll show you a more advanced setup where different Band-in-a-Box instruments get played through different synths. First though, we'll explain a little bit about the music you're hearing. Everything you're hearing was created simply by typing these chords into the chord chart, picking a style, setting the tempo, and pressing play. Band-in-a-Box then created everything you're hearing. The drums and guitar, as I said, are audio. They are not played through a synth or sampler of any kind. They are audio recordings of real musicians put together by Band-in-a-Box based on the chords and form of the song. The bass and piano here, as I mentioned, are MIDI super tracks. They also come from actual recordings of real musicians, but in this case they were recorded on a MIDI keyboard. MIDI basically just consists of note information, controllers, etc. So with MIDI, it's the actual synth that you're hearing. In this case, Garritan Jazz and Big Band in the ARIA player. Any MIDI that's played by Band-in-a-Box, whether it's these MIDI super tracks or the old school Band-in-a-Box styles, can therefore be routed to different synths. So you can control the sound of the instrument yourself, picking your own favorite synths. And that's what we'll show you now. We'll go back to the very start and show you step by step what you need to do. Here we are playing the same song as we had at the beginning, but right now we're using the built-in Mac sounds for the bass and piano. You can probably tell already that the sounds are not nearly as good as the Garritan sounds we were listening to at the beginning of the video. Well, let's get started showing you how to bring those back. To see what is actually generating the sound from the MIDI that Band-in-a-Box is sending, we go to the MIDI menu and pick Select MIDI Driver or Apple DLS Synth. And we can see that we have the Apple DLS synth, which is the built-in Mac sounds. In order to use different synths, we have to pick Mac OS X Core MIDI. You won't see the name of the actual synth you want to use here, like Garritan or ARIA or SampleTank, but Core MIDI is what you'll use to route the MIDI from Band-in-a-Box to those other synths. This takes us to the Select Ports Instruments dialog. This lets you pick exactly where the different instruments from Band-in-a-Box will be sent. If I click on one of these, you can see that it gives me two options, Apple DLS Synth or Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output. Apple DLS Synth again is just the built-in Mac sounds, and Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output is an option that will work for some synths, but not all. It does work with the ARIA player where I have Garritan Jazz and Big Band loaded, so I'll pick Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output here and set all ports to this. As I mentioned before, some other synth players do not work with Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output, so we'll be returning to this dialog later to see how you can put additional options into the list. So, Band-in-a-Box is now sending all MIDI to Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output, but there's nothing receiving that yet. So if I play right now, we won't hear the MIDI, just the real drums and real tracks guitar, which, as I mentioned before, are audio, not MIDI. So now we have to get something to receive the MIDI. I'll open up the ARIA player where I have Garritan Jazz and Big Band. Now, if I go to the ARIA Player menu and Preferences, here I can select the input MIDI devices. And as you see, Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output appears as an option, so I will select it. Now there's one final thing you need to do before you can play. These 16 slots that all say empty represent the 16 available MIDI channels. Band-in-a-Box will be sending different instruments on the different channels, so you need to load instruments into the correct slots. Let's go back into Band-in-a-Box for a minute, and we'll go to MIDI Settings. This shows you the channels that each instrument sends on. You can change these if you want to, but there's really no need to, especially for what we're doing here, so it will suffice to simply remember that bass is on channel 2 and piano is on channel 3. So back in the ARIA player on channel 2, I'll click where it says empty to load an upright bass. And on channel 3, I'll do the same, but here I'll load a piano. And now I'll play. You can now mix this as you like, either by using the mixer in the ARIA player, or by using the usual volume controls in Band-in-a-Box. With other software synths that are not demonstrated in this video, you can always check to see whether Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output appears as an option, and use it if it does. If not, there's another option, the IAC driver, which I'll show you in the next part of the video. Here we have another MIDI Supertracks piano, Country Pop John Even 120, with all the other instruments being real tracks. And again, we're back to the built-in Mac sounds. I'll start off with the same steps. Change the driver to Core MIDI. And change everything to Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output. And we'll try using a different synth, IK Multimedia's SampleTank. But in SampleTank, if I go to Audio MIDI Setup, under MIDI Input, Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output does not appear like it did with the ARIA player. As I mentioned earlier though, some synths do not work with this selected, and so there is another option. Back in Band-in-a-Box, we'll go back to the MIDI menu and select Core MIDI Audio MIDI Setup. That opens this setup dialog, which is part of the Mac operating system. You can also get to this same dialog by going to Applications, Utilities, Audio MIDI Setup. If we were trying to get a hardware synth going, we could add a device here, but for the software synths that we're using in this tutorial, what we want is the IAC driver. IAC stands for Inter-Application Communication, which is what's used to basically create virtual MIDI cables between different applications. We can see that the IAC driver is here, but the text and image appear faint, indicating that it's not enabled. To enable it, simply double-click on it and put a check beside Devices Online. And you can see that under ports we have IAC Bus 1. I'm actually going to add 2 more by pressing this plus button. I'll explain why later in the video. So we'll close that and close the Audio MIDI Setup dialog too. Now we made a change to that setup, but as you can see it hasn't actually appeared. In order to get it to appear, we have to switch back to Apple DLS Synth and then back to core MIDI. And we can now select IAC bus 1 and set all ports to this. Now here's a reason I added one of the extra buses. I need to set MIDI in to something different, otherwise it will be feeding back on itself, creating a MIDI feedback loop. So I'll pick IAC bus 3 as the input here. And I'll press OK. Now back in SampleTank, we'll again go to Settings, Audio MIDI Setup, and for MIDI input we want IAC driver IAC bus 1. Now just like the ARIA player, we have these 16 empty slots for the 16 MIDI channels. If we remember back, or we can look again, we can see that the piano sends on channel 3. So I'll click on channel 3 and go to SampleTank 2 Sounds, Piano, HQ Free Piano. And now we're getting piano sounds coming from SampleTank 2, joined by RealTrack's audio bass, guitars, and drums in Band-in-a-Box. You can then mix like we did, either in Band-in-a-Box or in SampleTank. And you can also change the sound in other ways in SampleTank. For example, add reverb here. I'm going to add another MIDI supertrack style to the mix here by control-clicking on an unused track, and I'll use the melody track, and picking Select MIDI Supertrack for this track. And I'd like to add a synth pad. Our song is at 120 beats per minute, so I'll pick this pop uplift style that was also recorded at that tempo, though any tempo will be stretched up to match the tempo of our song. Now, if we look at our MIDI settings, we can see that the melody sends on channel 4. So since we've put the synth pad on the melody track, we need to load a sound onto channel 4 in SampleTank. I'll start playback in Band-in-a-Box. We won't hear the synth until we actually select something for channel 4 in SampleTank. And I can now experiment with some different sounds. I'll try this one, Beyond Voyage. Or, for something more modern, maybe Sweep Pad. Or I could try something from Miroslav Philharmonic Sounds. An ensemble strings. Now finally, with this Band-in-a-Box song that has 2 separate MIDI tracks, this would be a great song to show using 2 different synths at the same time. If I go back into the Choose Ports dialog, I'll leave the piano on the piano track as IAC bus 1, but the synth that I put on the melody track I'll change to IAC bus 2. I'll now open Native Instruments Kontakt Player, where I have the Kontakt factory selection installed. If I go into the Preferences, I can see that Band-in-a-Box Virtual Output is an option here, so if I was using this for the first time, I could have just omitted the IAC step and used that. But I've already enabled IAC and selected IAC Bus 2 in Band-in-a-Box for the synth. So I'll set that to port C, just to keep it distinct from the others. This is just an internal routing system for Kontakt. Now, Kontakt is a little different from ARIA or SampleTank. It does not have 16 empty slots for the 16 channels. You simply pick the instrument you want, and I'll try this Bogart pad. Then in here, I pick port C, IAC bus 2, channel 4, because as you remember, anything on the melody track in Band-in-a-Box sends on channel 4. And now we're hearing real tracks bass, drums, electric guitar, and acoustic guitar coming out of Band-in-a-Box. Piano coming out of SampleTank. And synth coming from Kontakt. And I can experiment with some different synths here as well. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial on using Band-in-a-Box for Mac with a variety of different software synths. Enjoy!